I think I got it. Thank you very much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here at Lemnos. My first time to be in Greece, actually in Lemnos. Already I've learned something yesterday in our tour. I've noticed in the book some of the references in American naval history, a tribute to the HMS Agamemnon when it signed the treaty with Turkey to have been anchored at Budros Island. So now I know that that's an error, and I can correct that small detail and attribute it properly to Lemnos and Budros Bay. So thank you very much. To explain a little bit about the American Navy's role in the Mediterranean, it's important to understand the politics of the American foreign policy of the day. In the end of 1913, a new administration came into America, the Democratic government of Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson. At that time, it was apparent that Europe was heading toward war, and it was going to be, America would be affected by this war. But the government was very much of a, did not wish to be involved in the war, and the Americans were prevented, the American military forces were prevented from making any preparations for it. One of the interesting things on the naval side, for example, American naval officers were ordered not to comment about the war that was about to break out, and when it did break out in August of 1914. The famous American naval thinker Alfred Thayer Mahan published an article in the or in the New York newspapers that commented, saying something that he'd been saying for 20 years, that in case of war with America in Europe, the United States would have to be involved with it and prepared with it. And he was told by the government, personally by the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, that he was to cease any commentary. He protested this, and he was told that retired officers were also banned from doing so. So this was the approach to, you're all right? So not before. Okay, does that sound better?
Yes.
Good, thank you. The Woodrow Wilson government was very much anti-war, at least in preparation for war, so that they, when the Army or the Navy presented plans to develop and increase its size, the civil administration said absolutely no, and those plans were set aside, and there was no longer any discussion about them. As the years progressed, the United States policy was to attempt to negotiate the peace, to stand independently and neutral in the war, and to try to, as what President Wilson said, have peace without victory. This was his phrase. And this was finally rejected by the German government completely in December of 1916. And it was still the government by about this time, the government agreed to begin to build its navy. But this was only from a point of view of defensive operations in case Germany should win the war. The President's idea was to defend the United States in American waters, not really to participate on the Allied side. So this was another aspect of the war that was being very, very careful about it. And then by the end or early 1917, things began to change, and he began to realize that the United States was going to have to become part of the war. There are three factors in this. One was the Russian Revolution, and his assumption was that with the revolution, with the fall of the Tsarist government, Russia would become a republic among the general republics of the world and be a peaceful democracy. He also was concerned because the German government had taken initiatives in Mexico to attack the United States, and perhaps even to think about persuading the Japanese to join the Central Powers and to attack the United States in the Pacific. And then thirdly was the unrestricted submarine warfare of the Germans, which was affecting American shipping and American passengers on other flag ships. One interesting example of this, as Germany was pushing a major military threat into the Balkan area, Germans sent submarines to the North American coast. One of them, in fact, came to my town, Newport, Rhode Island, the U-53, and the captain came ashore, had a cup of tea with the Admiral President of the Naval War College, and press was out there, and it was raising all sorts of speculation about what the Germans were doing there. And then he went out to sea after spending a day there, and went out beyond into international waters, beyond the Antarctic Lightship, and sank 5 ships. Well, I always tell my students at the Naval War College, this is the first time that war really came to the Naval War College. But it was finally the United States agreed in March of 1917. The president of the Naval War College at that time, Rear Admiral WM.S. Sims, was sent incognito as a civilian to London to begin to make negotiations with the Admiralty about how the United States might participate in the war. And shortly thereafter, by April, the United States declared war against Germany, but they did not, at that time, declare war against Austria-Hungary, and they never did declare war on Turkey. So this was the first phase. And the agreement that the United States made at that time, as they entered the war, first of all, they wanted, President Wilson was very certain that it was to be an associated power, not an ally. So we were not part of the agreements that were made there. The United States did not know about the diplomatic agreements that had been made among the various allies. And President Wilson was deeply shocked to find out about all the secret agreements that had been made by the various powers about what different territorial seizures that would be made at that time. The President's American policy was that the United States would send supplies and be able to do some minor production, be able to use the American industrial support and get that across the Atlantic and perhaps convoy some American troops over. But initially, there were very few of these things. The United States agreed in general that the United States the Navy's participation would be under the Royal Navy, under the command of the Royal Navy, and the French, the American military forces would be under the French. So that essentially they were, at this point, agreeing to British strategy at sea and French strategy on the land. This later, as I'll point out in a minute, but it shows it was a conflict that developed, as it did also in the Second World War, about the Mediterranean versus the Central European front. But as they went in there, the Americans under Admiral Sims established a central naval headquarters in London, in which all activities in Europe were under, which worked very closely with the Admiralty. The first forces began to come over. They were interested in convoys in Ireland and in Brest, France. This is where the bases were. The American Navy had been very small. There was only about 50,000 men in the Navy at this point. At the opening of the war, that expanded to more than 500,000. There was very small, for example, aviation became important. Naval aviation became important. We only had 6 pilots at the opening of the war. By the end of the war, there were over 1,000. So the Navy had to develop widely. They had to develop in small craft, particularly for convoy vessels. So coming to the Mediterranean, the first point was Gibraltar. And this was part of the policy that Admiral Sims had developed, that the United States Navy would fill what holes were available in British policy or British strength. So one of the major issues which was about 25% of Allied trade and supplies were passing through the Strait of Gibraltar. And there was a great shortage of convoy escorts and escort vessels in that area. So this is one of the reasons why the United States established a base there in Gibraltar under Rear Admiral Albert Niblack, who commanded actually from 1917 through late 1917 through 1919. The American force there was restricted in a sense. It was directly under British command. As I mentioned earlier, there's a local British admiral in Gibraltar. The Americans reported to them and worked alongside them in that area. Most of the traffic coming from North America to the Mediterranean was not convoyed, although it was in the northern waters. Convoys were in that area going into Britain and into France. And there was a submarine American submarine detachment placed at the Azores in order to protect against German submarines attacking in that area and ships going sailing. American escorts coming out of the Mediterranean would take them out to about 10 degrees west longitude, but very restricted as far as in the western Mediterranean. Of course, the supplies that were coming through the Mediterranean and through Gibraltar area were very important for Allied war effort in the eastern Mediterranean. So they played a key role in that far. But American forces at first did not go beyond Malta. At first they didn't even go as far as Malta, they only went part way. And there was others, Spain was neutral, so that there was a special convoy that was taking forces to Italy. There was another going to France, and French concerns in Morocco, in that area. And American ships were involved in some of the coastal patrols in Morocco to prevent German intervention there. It was finally, and then as the war continued and Austria-Hungary, finally the United States did declare war against Austria-Hungary, and at that point began to move a little bit further into the Mediterranean. And the threat here was with German submarines and Austro-Hungarian submarines in the Adriatic. So the Americans have established a base at Corfu. There were some 35 American sub-chasers. These are very small wooden vessels, motor launches, that were used for attacking submarines. Strangely enough, they look very much on the surface, they look like a submarine on the surface. So they were often attacked by accident because they look like a surface submarine in very odd-looking shapes. So they didn't look like a surface vessel. But they were used, particularly in the Straits of Gibraltar area. There were many small vessels, converted yachts. Some of the very rich American merchant people and industrial leaders had lent their rented actually their yachts to American Navy for $1. The then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had come up with this idea and suggested it to his friends at the New York Yacht Club, and they had a large number of these things were provided to the Navy. And what they did, we have their version. The idea of underwater sound listening was just coming in. There was really no offensive way in which to attack submarines at this point, except that they could use depth charges and this sort of thing. So this is what the boats were doing, at least trying to keep submarines under the surface in the Gibraltar area, and occasionally to attack. They had a few 1 or 2 kills in that region. There was a plan similar to that in the North Sea to make a mine barrage across the Otranto Strait at the entrance to the Adriatic, and that was really, from the American point of view, Americans didn't get too involved in that. They had several ideas and proposals about where it should be and how it should be across there, but that was part of it. And then, as these developed here, this is the approach is that the idea was convoying troops and supplies. This was the main approach, again reflecting the President's views of the war. With the peace arriving in November of 1918, that did not end American naval participation in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean. But this proposed and really reflected more directly the President's ideas about the uses of the Navy. In the Adriatic, for example, the United States was part of the, well, they were part of the Versailles Treaty, and one of the American points was to try to get to implement the provisions of the treaty. The President also had his ideas of 14 points, the idea of freedom of religion, freedom of national approaches. One of the things they were trying to do, for example, in the Balkans, as you know, creating the different nationalities in different countries in those areas. So the President was using the Navy to do that sort of thing. The United States was given, actually, a very unusual, it's the first time in American naval history, was given a section of the central Dalmatian coast in the Adriatic to supervise and to make sure, particularly the United States position was to prevent the Italians from taking that area, because the United States government, here we were supposedly an ally of Italy, or at least an associated power on the same side of Italy, but here we were opposing what the Italians wanted to do, which was to expand into the former Austro-Hungarian territory in the central Dalmatian area. And so the U.S. Navy remained in that area until 1921, promoting that. There was a group, an American Army regiment in Italy that was about to be sent to that region to support this operation, but we realized that the American government realized that the Italians were using this as a means of promoting their own control of that area. So that was, the President did not allow that to happen. So that continued up until that it was settled there, and so the new Yugoslav government could get into position. A similar thing happened in Turkish waters. The United States had not gone to war with Turkey. We had a small vessel, a converted yacht, USS Scorpion, based in Constantinople, that was interned by the Turkish government, and during the war, because we were associated with the other powers, but it was kept there, and so after the end of the peace treaty, the United States was able to use that as the flagship for the U.S. naval forces in Turkish waters, commanded by a well-known admiral named Rear Admiral Mark Bristol, who remained in that area well into the 1920s in dealing with all the issues in this area. So the first issue, of course, was getting the supplies, and the American Relief Organization was handled through the embassy in Constantinople, and the Navy was very much a part of that. For a long time, it wasn't an ambassador, there was just a diplomatic representative, and the admiral became, for a time, the chief diplomatic representative in the area. The aid that was coming to Greece, for example, through that chain, a group of destroyers and a number of these submarine chasers were using the aid that was coming into that area and being ministered up to Piraeus, particularly in Greece, for supply of American relief opposition in that area. Later, as the provisions of the treaty with the Ottoman Empire was worked out, and the provisions about the Greek territory being opened in Smyrna, the Americans were part of the Allied forces that were present to make sure that the treaty was carried out. The Americans, and the number of these agreements that went on, some of these agreements were not really clearly in line with what the President wanted the United States to do, but he agreed to do them because the ultimate idea that the countries would eventually join the League of Nations, which was one of his major ideas, that we would have an international organization that would prevent wars in the future, and would be the idealistic approach here. So he was promoting that and accepting things on a temporary basis, assuming that later with the League of Nations that this could continue. So as part of that, then of course the new Turkish revolution were taking place, and the Greek forces being forced back out of Smyrna. Again, the United States was again involved in the evacuation of people from Smyrna. Some 250,000 people were helped to come back across there through American ships. By this time, we had more destroyers as well as these smaller ships there. The American battleship Arkansas was brought in to the fleet into the Mediterranean at this point. So this was all part of the President's idea of helping stabilize the peace and using the Navy for this sort of purpose in the Mediterranean. So very different than it was in other parts of Europe, I think. And I think the story is really not very well known, either in America or perhaps here. So that in general is the general outline of these forces and what the American Navy was doing in the Mediterranean. By 1925 or 27, actually, the Turkish mission was finished under Admiral Bristol, and he went on to the Asiatic station where he commanded the U.S. Asiatic fleet for a number of years. And so things moved into another area. But one of the lessons learned, I think, in this experience, which came through in from the Second World War, there were a number of things. One was the problem of the Allies not being able to effectively organize themselves together. Each Allied representative had to report back to his separate country, his national headquarters, and there was no equivalent of, say, NATO or the Allied command in these areas, so that much of these things could not be solved on the scene, but had to be referred back to national capitals and then back again and back to the War Council, the War Council meeting in Versailles. There was an advisory naval committee, which the United States played a role in, but that was only an advisory body, so this was again one of the difficult areas. And there had been also, as I mentioned earlier, the debate between, as there was in 1918, there was a debate, it was very similar to the debate in 1943, as to where the major American forces should be placed, in the eastern or in this area of the Baltic region, or in the central German front. And in both cases, the agreement was to support the German force, and the forces based in Germany, because of the nature of the supply. It was easier to get supplies to France, to support the French army in that area, than it was to get them all the way into the Mediterranean and to support troops on this side. Thank you very much.